As believers, you want to look at the issue of adoption from a biblical perspective. And if you look carefully and you study ancient history and New Testament history, what you begin to understand is that there was a very clear understanding of what adoption was in society. In ancient Near East history, what you begin to see in society was a concept of adoption that recognized the granting of the rights owed only to a legal heir or a birth child to a former slave. Now here's where it becomes very exciting for us, because as God called out the nation of Israel from slavery, and he brought them into the wilderness, preparing them to go into the promised land, he uses the language that these people are my people, and he actually begins to use for the first time in Scripture language that describes the nation of Israel as the children of God. That was completely consistent with an ancient understanding of adoption. Here were this group of people who were slaves in Egypt, now being taken and cared for in a personal fashion by the God of Israel, Jehovah God. Now this stands out because the mission of the nation of Israel was to be a light to the Gentile nations, to point to the one true God. No other foreign god in the world had that kind of relationship with its people. And so God distinguished himself as a God who could be known intimately, personally, and he used the language of family, father, child, to describe the kind of intimacy that is accessible and available to his chosen children. So the nation of Israel itself is understood to be the adopted children of God. And this was the understanding of all the foreign nations around them when they begin to see this particular relationship between the Israelites and Jehovah. You had the same kind of understanding in the New Testament period, where the granting of the rights of an heir were bestowed upon a former slave. It was a very formal process. It's actually where we get the word adoption. Later became referred to in the Latin as adoptio. And this was the legal transaction where a slave was granted the rights of a natural child. This is the context in which the Scripture speaks about adoption. And now you begin to understand the significance, spiritually speaking, of adoption. So when Paul writes about us becoming adopted by God, we who were former slaves to sin and now have been set free, but not just set free, we were taken into the very family of God and being granted the very rights that are really only due to his firstborn, his beloved Son, Jesus Christ. Now this is where it gets so exciting, because the language of Scripture comes alive. When you think about the language that describes the household of God, the church, the language of brothers and sisters is understood in the context or the theology of adoption. When we're considered to be joint heirs with Christ, it's adoption language that is seen. And so you begin to understand our relationship with Jesus Christ as not the first begotten, as Jesus Christ is, the beloved Son of God. We are the adopted children of God and brought right into that familiar or family relationship with God the Father and his Son Jesus Christ. This is an amazing thing that distinguishes Christianity from any other faith system. No other world religion has as central to its belief system, or even a tenet of its belief system, this identification of family relationship, where followers of that deity are actually considered to be the very children of that God. This is distinct to Christianity. The other thing that's important to understand, it is characteristic and descriptive of what occurs in redemption. Adoption is redemptive language. And so the work that God does in our life with regard to salvation is the work of adoption. And one of the things that stood out to the Puritans, they emphasized the doctrine of adoption in their writings and in their churches. And you need to understand this. God could have chosen to elect us. He could determine to justify us, to forgive us, to sanctify us. He could have accomplished all the works of redemption and salvation on our behalf. But it is the theology and doctrine of adoption that alone grants us the intimate relationship into the presence of God. He could have done all those other wonderful graces on our behalf, and we would have been eternally blessed. But he didn't stop there. And it would be exciting at this day and age for the church to recover that rich theology or doctrine of adoption that was so critical to the Puritans. And as they taught that doctrine, what they emphasized was it should be Christians who, as salt and light in the world, should be the ones who reach out and care for orphan children, at-risk children, street children, should become advocates for children to care for them, because in so doing that, they illustrated to a lost and fallen world what was available to them in redemption and the very adoption of God. The converse is true as well, is if Christians don't practice adoption and care for at-risk children, then they rob the world, if you will, of a living parable or a visual illustration of the greater spiritual truth. So if anyone should be motivated to care for children, it should be Christians, not just out of general compassion. Children are endearing. All of our hearts are pulled to care for children because they're vulnerable and they need someone to advocate on their behalf. But it's not just compassion. It is actually a part of illustrating the gospel to a fallen world and declaring the uniqueness of our God above all other gods, that He alone can be known and can be worshiped. So it is really critical that the church today recover the doctrine of adoption, but the practice of adoption and care for these children, because in so doing, we live out our calling as the church.